Honorable Minister please address us.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Honourable Speaker, you're a speaker here as well. Secretary General of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, presiding officers, members of various legislatures, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to advise the Speaker. The precision is very important, sir. It's 19 years and 3 days today. I'd like to thank the legislative sector for convening the conference on this important topic of the role of parliaments in economic transformation and development. I also want to thank the Speaker of the National Assembly in absentia for inviting me to address you here today. The recognition in this topic of, in the topic that focuses on sustainable growth and development as being a long-term issue is in fact what we want to concentrate on. Because the moment we recognize that, it sets in train a series of questions about the adequacy of instruments used by parliaments for the evaluation of oversight of executive proposals for development. These are exceedingly important issues as growth and development tend to create irreversible effects. Pause for a moment and reflect on the South Africa we knew 20 years ago, a country on the brink of disaster with the promise of the first democratic elections still at some future undefined date. A country whose economy had stagnated, having contracted by 2.1% in 1992. A country with a gaping budget deficit. In fact, the budget in 1993 was set against a fiscal deficit of 9.3%, and it was set for 8.0% in 1994. Total public sector debt was 64% of GDP in 94, and foreign reserves were only enough for 1 month's import cover. In fact, that's a bit of a misnomer, because foreign reserves at the point of democracy, and just bear in mind that this Friday past marked 19 years to the day since Nelson Mandela was first inaugurated as our president. But the reserves at that point, 19 years ago, were in fact negative, because while there was 1 month's cover on the one side of the balance sheet, on the other side of the balance sheet, there was a net open forward position of some $24 billion that was owed. Budget expenditure showed vast inequalities manifested. If one takes the example of a woman teacher in the Transkei Education Department who earned a mere 46% of that of a white male teacher employed in the House of Assembly. Democracy couldn't countenance this, and if the trajectory of that 9.3% deficit had continued, then our debt to GDP ratio today would have been much higher than that of Greece, and debt service costs, already at 25% of GDP in 1994, would probably have been closer to the 50% mark now. So 50 cents in every rand collected as taxes would pay for yesterday's expenditure. And when you try and understand economic policy making and understand the long-term nature of the decisions, it's fundamentally important that we look to our own experience in this country. And I want to say to you now, because I'll say to you again in the course of this talk, that these decisions are not popular but necessary. The intervention in macroeconomic policy in 1996 was occasioned initially by a conversation between the then President Nelson Mandela, the Deputy President Thabo Mbeki, and I. And the concern was that debt service costs by 1997 were going to be higher than what we were spending on education. Madiba was very clear about this. Education is about tomorrow. Debt service is about yesterday. And if you're spending more on yesterday than you are on tomorrow, then you can't be living true to the values about creating better tomorrows for our people. That statement by Madiba laid the basis for an unresolved, I'm saying unresolved because some people still can't forget it, discourse in growth and development theory, but one that set our country on a very different path. At that point of our democracy 19 years ago, the per capita GDP was 28,536 Rand. In real terms, that number's grown to 37,476 now against that point. The challenge that continues to elude us in this context is employment creation. If indeed we could enlarge the cohort of working age population who are in employment, we would see a very spectacular fall in our Gini coefficient. The point to be stressed about economic policy and its impact on growth and sustainable development is that the policy instruments need to be carefully selected because the consequences, both positive and negative, have long-run effects. There has to be a simple logic to this. When we identify problems or when our economic analysis reflects that there are either difficulties or opportunities down the track, do the maths, evaluate the results of that exercise against an agreed policy framework, and then take the decision. Policymakers should neither procrastinate nor prevaricate. Take the decision. The sooner the decision is taken, the better. And bear in mind that these may often not be the most popular decisions to take, but they must be taken. It is a great asset if Parliament understands this logic and is able to back even unpopular decisions. Let's look at the example of China, where Deng Xiaoping 35 years ago called for economic policy reforms that declared, "We will cross the river by groping the stones with our feet." In 1980, China's economy was 7.3% the size of the US economy. Today, it is the world's second largest economy. And by either 2040 or 2050, depending on whose analysis you use, China will have the world's largest economy, from 7.3% just in living memory. China lifted 700 million people out of abject poverty. And China can now look forward to a position in 2030 where they will have just over 200 million college graduates. That's more than the total workforce of the United States. And the way in which China is approaching this is that each of those graduates must find themselves in gainful employment, utilizing their skills for the benefit of China and the world. The country must make the choices. In fact, the country did make the choices. And the big choices for what we're living through now were made in 1975 by Deng Xiaoping. If you go and read Chinese history, you will find that he wasn't very popular, certainly in parts of the Communist Party of China, for taking the positions that Deng Xiaoping was taking. But look at the long run, look at the increases in quality of life of people, and go back and try and understand why that happened in a country like China. We can also look at the example of a country like Brazil, and here I want to borrow from a presentation made by Joel Netchitenge, who is the executive director of the Mapungubwe Institute. He's also a commissioner on the National Planning Commission. And Joel addressed the COSATU's Chris Hani Institute, and he compared the economies of China and Brazil, and this is amongst other things what he said, and I quote, "If we were to draw parallels between South Africa and Brazil during the decade of the 2000s, it can be argued that we experienced roughly similar sizes of economic growth, but our economy started to heat up even more, even before the global economic crisis, because we had surpassed trend growth. The South African unemployment rate was reduced from 31% in 2003 to 23% in 2008, and access to social grants was massively expanded, thus increasing aggregate demand or buying power. But industrial policy did not adequately respond to this, as we continue to import the very goods that the massive consumers need, such as toasters, microwave ovens, suitcases, TVs, and cell phones. While economic growth and social grants improved the standards of living of the poor, the living standard and wealth effect among the rich across the color line clearly grew much faster, unquote. In the case of both China and Brazil, decisions were taken based on sound analysis and assessment of their policy objectives. It's important that we appreciate that sustainable growth and development require policy stability. Changing policy too often has the effect of destabilizing the bureaucracy and therefore not allowing policies to take effect and show results. Our performance as a country on this measure has been uneven at best. It's worth pausing for reflection on why we faltered on something so self-evident. After 1994, it was apparent through our policies that the government was aware that our people had high expectations. However, the performance of the public service did not reflect the improvements necessary to meet our policy objectives. Many of their failures had their root causes in the capacity of the state machinery inherited from apartheid. The corruption, the absence of a culture of public service, poor skills, among others. Instead of analyzing the root causes of the performance failures and embarking on the painstaking process of institution building, we resorted to changing policy each time we were dissatisfied with the results we were attaining. We are not suggesting that the approach to policy must be completely rigid either. On the contrary, existing policies do need to be reviewed on the basis of evidence and modified or even overhauled where necessary. Understanding the notion of policy as, and I want to quote the definition, a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by an organization or individual, unquote, is crucial in this approach. Ultimately, it is about keeping the policy objectives in sight while possibly modifying the route to attain those objectives. The policy objective, in the case of economic transformation and development, has to be to lift our people from poverty. Too often, however, new policies are or were implemented in an unconsidered fashion. As new leaders seek to make their mark was a response to the latest international fad. All you need to say is this is international best practice. Don't worry about the evidence. Just declare it to be international best practice and everything falls into place. Many of the problems with public sector performance have to do with deeply rooted systemic issues, and there's no quick fix substitute for a long-term and strategic approach to enhancing institutional capacity. Our experience in the past 20 years reminds us that social and economic change take place over a long period, and that change is not a linear process that can be planned with precision in advance as though it were factory production. A long-term vision, which sets out the type of society we want to be, is important to guide our social and economic transformation programs. Yes, there will be obstacles in the way that will threaten to derail our transformation program. There may even be natural disasters and human-induced shocks that erode the resources we need successfully to implement our transformation program. Often these challenges will require change in the tactics we employ. The presence of a long-term vision is important to ensure that the change of tactics does not result in a loss of direction. The complexity and unpredictable nature of how transformation happens means that Parliament cannot take a narrow annual view when it performs its oversight function. With great respect, Honourable Speaker, we are now living through that annual cycle but it's an annual cycle. I'll go before Parliament tomorrow with one of the budgets. It's very much an annual cycle. We're suggesting that Parliament has a critical role to play in ensuring that all actions of the executive take us in the direction of our long-term vision. The National Development Plan is our long-term vision and plan which provides overarching goals to be achieved by 2030. It helps us to engage in dialogue to build consensus on the key obstacles facing us and specific actions to be undertaken. It provides a common framework for detailed planning and creates a basis for making choices about how best to use the limited resources we have. The NDP outlines targets which are carefully calibrated milestones along a path to prosperity and equity for all. When President Mandela made the statement that debt service costs could not be higher than what we were spending on education, he was making a choice. Sustainable growth and development is about setting priorities in expenditure and understanding that prioritizing tomorrow above today has long-term positive outcomes. Today, we face a choice between prioritizing current expenditure or investment. Even in good times, striking an appropriate balance between these two items of expenditure is a challenge. The present economic climate makes it much, much harder. There are different levels to making choices. It's possible to receive popular support for making what is a morally just decision to reduce our carbon footprint and be opposed by the same citizens when taking decisions to give effect to the same commitment they applauded earlier. The recent electricity price determination debate is very instructive. Measures to reduce emissions from cars are similarly unpopular, even as citizens support the goal for cleaner environments. I raise these issues because no government derives any pleasure from the suffering of the citizens of its country, and yet across the globe, governments face making decisions that inflict pain on its citizens. Sometimes enduring some pain today may be necessary to secure a better future. Attached to this is the important role for balancing the need to protect the poor while pursuing goals that are in the long-term interest of everyone. In certain instances, there are competing demands which manifest in different sectors, between protecting land for agriculture to ensure food security for the growing urban population and urban development, between mining and environmental sustainability, between exporting our produce and keeping it for domestic use. What is the role of Parliament in resolving these kinds of conflicts? Members of Parliament have a legal and political obligation to work in the interests of the public first. It is with Parliament that leadership, responsibility and accountability rests. And in terms of the long-term growth and development objectives of the country, it is in Parliament where the debates about what is in the best interests of the public should be raised and discussed. Annually, Parliament appropriates funds for each government department to implement programs in line with its mandate. This responsibility alone places a huge burden on Parliament, acting on behalf of citizens who are both taxpayers and beneficiaries of government services to ensure that the resources available are used correctly. Long-term economic development starts with effective oversight of public finances, of policies and implementation. This oversight takes place within the chambers of Parliament, as well as during inspections out in the field when projects are underway. If the public know that the elected officials are actually interested in their lived experience, they have greater confidence in the state. Parliament has to do a thorough cost-benefit analysis of all proposals and plans. Every proposal, no matter how trivial, has a cost and a benefit. If a department says that they will be investing in a program to help 10 people to get work, ask what the cost of the program is, ask what the overheads are, ask where the money will come from, ask how we will measure success, ask who will implement the program and how it will be implemented, through which agency, etc. Remember that money is not printed by SARS. It's collected from taxpayers. If taxes are raised and the individual or firm does not have that money to spend or invest, every rand spent by a government has an opportunity cost. Every rand raised in taxes could have other uses. Are we using it more productively than would otherwise be used? This is a question that every parliamentarian has to ask constantly. Let me use education as an example. It may seem like a slightly unusual place to start when addressing economic development, but education has the power to disrupt and break established patterns of poverty and exclusion. Without education, the children of rural citizens, of informal settlement dwellers, of farm workers will grow up to be poor adults. They will earn income far below the national average. They will have very short life expectancy. They will be victims of food insecurity and inadequate nutrition, and in general, they will tend to have a precarious existence. More than that, not only will they lack the skills required to either be employable or to be entrepreneurs, but they will be dependent on the state for social grants. Faced with these conditions, the children of these citizens will automatically be disadvantaged, thus continuing the cycle of poverty. Making sure that all young people receive education of the highest quality is exceedingly important for long-term economic development, and Parliament has both the power and the constitutional and legal instruments to influence change in the quality of education that young people receive. We can only grow and develop our country if we take a broader view. We cannot focus on a single aspect like education without taking into account the realities being faced by too many of our youth. I wonder how many of us would continue to attend school under circumstances where we have to walk long distance to that place and back due to lack of transport services because the department's budgeting was inadequate. When we did get there, the building was falling apart and there was no running water because the tender for maintenance was given to someone's friend or family. When we got back home, there were no libraries because they were burnt down in the last round of service delivery protests, or the electricity was cut again due to cable theft. If we want to develop the skills that are crucial for growing the economy, then improving on the lives of our people in every respect must get equal attention from those of us elected to protect the interests of our people. Long-term sustainable growth and development are necessary inclusive projects that require consistent and critical engagement and oversight. Whether it is the reduction of public debt or the release of funds towards social spending or oversight of implementation of the long-term goals of the National Development Plan, it is Parliament that has the responsibility to ensure that government keeps its promises to its people. To ensure sustainability of economic growth and development, it is important that we get the sequence right, starting with design, adoption, implementation, monitoring, to evaluation. Parliament has a key role to play. In terms of monitoring, portfolio committees must necessarily go into the field to inspect projects and report back to the House. But it cannot be snapshot assessments. It is fundamentally important that Parliament and legislatures take a long-term view of the plans and policies being presented to it. While it may sound incredibly impressive every time a member of the executive announces sweeping changes and extensive plans, these must be evaluated against all that has gone before. Does it build on previous work done, or is it a new policy direction? Is it similar to previous announcements, possibly with a new name? And more importantly, is there continued congruency with the adopted long-term plans of the country? The responsibility of budgetary oversight must be in the context of broader departmental 5-year strategic plans, as well as the medium-term strategic framework and the long-term plan for the country. The question that we need to resolve is how we make oversight of long-term plans meaningful under 5-year electoral cycles. How do we prevent short-term thinking and acting both by the executive and the legislatures? How do we deal with the need to leave a legacy? To a large extent, these issues are dependent on vigilant members supported by strong administrative systems. Who checks that the executive has responded to requests for reports? What sanctions exist for non-compliance? How seriously are constitutional responsibilities taken? In conclusion, let me reiterate the fact that policies have long-run effects, and that is why the legislative sector should be concerned about the choices exercised. This raises a number of important questions. Does our legislative sector have the instruments to evaluate the impact on long-term growth and development of choices? This question takes on a very particular form, especially at a time when Parliament is debating budget votes. Is it required to look at long-term impacts of any decision? Does Parliament pause to reflect on previous decisions it had supported or countered and evaluate? Are members of Parliament left to their own devices? Are portfolio committees sufficiently supported when these decisions are taken? Democracies are only effective systems to promote economic growth when they can combine a strong accountability chain with competent administrative and managerial systems of public service. The accountability chain is built from Parliament down to the people. You have a critical role to play in strengthening the accountability chain, raising the quality of analysis demanded, and in requesting clear evidence of performance is the beginning of the strengthening of that chain. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to me.